Welcome back, everybody. It is Monday, October 26th. We are now, again, just 8 days away from the elections in November. This is our 8-day edition of our 10-day countdown. Once again, every single day until November 3rd, we are coming out with a presidential election update and a Senate election prediction update. There are new developments, okay? Basically, every day there's always a lot of news, like sort of a rad rash of rumors right before an election. For all my sports fans out there, think of it like an NBA trade deadline. You know how exciting those always are. Those are always so fun to watch. There's always like a mad, crazy rash of rumors right over the last 15 minutes, and then sometimes nothing happens, and sometimes a whole lot happens. So it's a little hard sometimes to figure out exactly where some of these races stand and whatnot. But this is kind of the last little bit that we're in here. Okay, so we are going to get right into it here with the state of Alaska. The GOP has been forced into spending in states like this, in Alaska, in Kansas, in South Carolina, in some races that are a little bit less high up the pecking order. Compared to some of these true swing states, like, again, the core four that I've pointed to a lot: Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Maine, and then true coin flips in Montana and Iowa, and then some maybe not exactly coin flips, but very close races in Georgia, and then a little bit less close in Michigan and South Carolina. So let's get right into it here. So as we were saying, with Alaska, the GOP has had to spend here, I think, less because they're too concerned about the outcome of this race, and more because they just have to prevent an absolute bloodbath from unfolding. I think the fact that we're seeing them spend on some of those third tier races is because they sense that this could just be a huge Democratic wave year, and as a result, they're going to have to hold the line a little bit and prevent the Democrats, because, let's say, because in 2022 the map is even more favorable for them. And I think what they're saying is, look, we may have to capitulate the Senate all around this time, but what we cannot do is give the Democrats an opportunity in 2 years to pursue a potentially filibuster-proof majority. Because if the Democrats have back-to-back huge election cycles in the Senate, they could at least approach that. Because look, if they do what happened in 2014, they could flip 2 seats in Georgia, 5 in Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, North Carolina, Maine, another one in Montana. Like, they could just sweep this thing and flip 8 seats, for crying out loud, and then flip 5 more in 22. And God only knows what could happen, at that point in terms of almost getting to 60. So that's obviously a long shot, but I think that's part of the calculation here. Of course, Dan Sullivan has been leading in the polls throughout the election season, and that's obviously going to help him. This, to me, I'm still only able to label as a lean because, again, Alaska is a hard state to gather the pulse of. We don't always know exactly where this state stands. It can be a little flimsy from time to time in terms of the accuracy in the polling. It's a very difficult state to poll. Even some of the highly ranked pollsters have been a little bit off in that state in the past. But again, that's the best data that we have. Al Gross is an independent. We know that Alaskans like independents. Of course, Lisa Murkowski is one of them, even though she caucuses with the Republican Party. But that's kind of where this race stands as of now. I don't necessarily think that Al Gross is out of this quite yet, but that's where the race stands. Jeff Merkley, we know he's going to be fine. I know that some of the evaluators have not actually labeled this safe, but I mean, I'm not even sure Jeff Merkley knows who his opponent is. I mean, it's not a very close race by any means. I say if Jeff Merkley loses this seat, I don't know that there would be a more shocking development in recent electoral history than if that were to happen. So this is going to be called right at closing hour. Same with Jim Risch in Idaho against Paula Jordan, who ran unsuccessfully for governor 2 years ago. Props to her for continuing to try, at least, up in a state like this. Again, as we've mentioned, this is a state that I think the Democrats ought to at least begin to sort of monitor, not spend in, but just monitor, because we've seen the margins there be kind of interesting. We've seen some Democrats get around like 38, 39% of the vote there. Now, just for some context, that's the same share that the Democrats get or sometimes in Tennessee. Remember, Phil Bredesen was one of the best candidates the Democrats could have fielded for the Senate in 2018 against Marsha Blackburn. He only got 43%. Okay, so Yeah, that's kind of analogous right there. And of course, it wasn't that long ago when Tennessee belonged to the Democrats. So, just for some context there. Okay, now in Arizona, as we've mentioned in the presidential election prediction videos, this is a bit of a realignment state for them. And Mark Kelly, who is running for Senate here against Martha McSally, is part of that. He has outraised Martha McSally basically at every turn. I'm a little surprised that the national Republican bodies that are in charge of helping them retain the Senate are still spending on this race. To be entirely honest with you, Mark Kelly has led every step of the way throughout this election season. He's led for about 150 straight days now. Martha McSally is deeply disliked in this state, as we know. She lost 2 years ago to Kyrsten Sinema. And I think for the Democrats, this is a little bit of a lucky break for them because let's say this was flipped. Let's say Mark Kelly was the one who won 2 years ago and now it was Kyrsten Sinema. Sinema could potentially run into some problems in that she, I think, would have to answer some of the questions that Mark Kelly is having to answer, which is where exactly do you stand on court packing, and where exactly do you stand on issues that could be seen as a little bit more quote unquote radical, as the right has labeled them, and things like that. Now, why is it different for Kyrsten Sinema too? Well, the reason is Kyrsten Sinema has been sort of advertised and labeled as a very moderate Democratic senator. Okay, and oftentimes when we bring up the issues of court packing and abolishing the filibuster or the Electoral College, which of course can't just be done by the Senate, the other one that is pointed to is Joe Manchin over here in West Virginia. So because Mark Kelly, while not some hyper liberal, is not Kyrsten Sinema, I think that is helping the Democrats because 2 years ago those issues were not being talked about. Whereas now they are, and Mark Kelly is not somebody who's sort of right on the fringe a little bit, who could potentially turn off some of those voters. Because let's face it, sometimes what we've seen in these states is it's not just a matter of, well, are you, very far to the left or the right, or are you in the middle? Sometimes it almost hurts you if you're right in the middle, because then the voters actually feel like it's necessary to ask you those questions, and then they will critique your answer. Whereas in the case of Mark Kelly, no one's asking him those questions because they kind of assume they know where he stands on those things, and so he doesn't have to answer to them. So I know that's kind of a double-edged sword, but at the same time, I think that is the way this worked out for the Democrats is they had the right candidate run at the right time for both of these Senate seats. All that combined with steady fundraising and steady polling has me still labeling this likely 8 days away for Mark Kelly. All right, now in Montana, the Democratic Party just can't quite break through here. They nominated the best possible candidate that they could have in this race. And that's one thing, that is a theme you're going to see over the course of this map, is the Democrats have been able to gather a very strong group of candidates to challenge the Republican incumbents in these states. Steve Bullock is the only Democrat that can win a Senate seat here, of course, other than Jon Tester, who is a Democratic senator from here. But Bullock is the only one who could win the other seat. Okay, let's put it that way. He is the current governor of Montana. Poll after poll shows that he is the most popular politician in this state. Interestingly enough, though, when he is matched up against Steve Daines, he's down. Just barely, but down. He's down by, I would say, 2, maybe 3 points. And that's about where I expect that to end up in this race. What's interesting is that at the same time, there is a governor's race going on here between Mike Cooney and Greg Gianforte. Greg Gianforte, of course, has been a controversial figure. Okay, in the past, he body slammed a reporter. We remember that shortly before the Democrats kind of rushed a bunch of money up into this House race. Shortly after that, unsuccessfully in the end. What's strange, though, is that you would say, okay, well, surely if the current governor and the lieutenant governor, who are both running for other office, they're both losing, then surely the Republicans are going to be able to win this House seat, right? Well, Kathleen Williams, the Democrat who has run unsuccessfully for office before, is just barely edging out Matt Rosendale, who is also running for this statewide seat. He has also run for office before. So there are a lot of familiar faces on the ballot this time around. You have the Senate race, which is between the current governor and an incumbent, a governor's race, which is an open seat between the current lieutenant governor and the current House member, and then the House race is being contested by 2 figures who have both run for office in Montana before. Okay, so voters in the state have got to be just exhausted by the amount of campaigning going on, not even to mention the presidential race. So there's all kinds of stuff happening in the state. Now, again, kind of like Alaska, it's a tough state to poll. I would be a little surprised by this, but it's not out of the question that the Democrats could sweep this in Montana and win all three races. They could win the president's, or not the president, the Senate race, the governor's race, the House race here. We definitely know they won't win the presidency here. But since this is a Senate prediction election video, I am still only labeling this tilt for Steve Daines. A little bit can change here. I will say this, though. There are only 8 days left, okay? And if Steve, here's the thing about these polls, is that if you suddenly take the lead in a couple polls, right? Well, I can't just forget the fact that you've trailed, in the case of Steve Bullock, for like 60 to 80 days now, you know? And so with only 8 days left, and mind you, a lot of people have already voted, so those polls may not hold as much weight. You know, these characterizations, like, it's going to take something pretty substantial in order for me to change one of them at this point. Not change them from lean to likely, but, you know, with it, like, not change them between tiers, but change them altogether between who might actually take the edge. We know about Wyoming. Now, Colorado, the Republicans have waved the white flag. Okay, Cory Gardner's done. And I think the biggest piece of evidence of this is that he just voted to confirm Justice Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Okay, he knows it's over. John Hickenlooper has defeated him. And I'm not saying that neither side should take these last 8 days seriously and neither side should even pay attention, because at the end of the day, Cory Gardner is going to get over 40% of the vote, and it is a race, and yada, yada, yada. But John Hickenlooper, I mean, it's like, again, you go back to sports, you're in a basketball game, you're up 15 points with 1 minute left in the fourth quarter. It's not that it's never happened before, but if you did it 100 times, it may not even happen at all. And, you know, maybe once it happens, you know, maybe. So something absolutely ridiculous would have to happen in order for this to not go the Democratic Party's way. I'm talking like John Hickenlooper would have to be recorded on tape doing some of the most heinous and offensive things known to man in order for this to change. He's led all the way through the election season. I mean, I almost compare this, the final margins won't be the same way, but I almost compare this to Illinois back in 2016 when Tammy Duckworth defeated Mark Kirk. Mark Kirk was an incumbent GOP senator, and he didn't even get 40% of the vote. Okay, if you're an incumbent and you don't get 40%, okay, Heidi Heitkamp was in North Dakota, for goodness sake. Okay, a ruby red state. She got 44% of the vote in 2018. All right. So, I mean, if you're the incumbent, and by the way, I'm not like Heidi Heitkamp, you know, being the incumbent and losing with only 44%, that's not a great showing. I don't think it'll be ultimately that low for Cory Gardner, but he's not going to win this race. John Hickenlooper has a shoe-in at this point. It's likely. Ben Ray Lujan, that's kind of the same thing. I'm going to label it safe because this is an open race between him and Mark Ronchetti. He has the lead. He's had it throughout the campaign season. The Democrats haven't been too concerned about this race. It is a race that we need to pay attention to because it is New Mexico. It's not the safest of safe states. You know, the Republicans could do well here. It was only up until 2018 when they had a Republican governor here. We know about all that, so it's interesting to watch. But there are your two pickups for the Democrats. South Dakota is always a state that's kind of fascinating to watch because, as we know, the Democratic Party can do a lot of positive things here. It's been a minute since they, you know, were able to kind of respond a little bit after losing Tim Johnson. And remember, again, ever since 2008, a lot of states have shifted far to the right, even though some of them are shifting back leftward. South Dakota was one of them. Now, in the most recent gubernatorial race between Kristi Noem and Bill Sutton, the Democrat, got over 47% of the vote, something people have lost sight of. In fact, like, it's, you know, there's a Democratic candidate or a Democratic governor in Kansas right now. There's a Democratic governor in Louisiana and in Kentucky. It's far more likely, I think, on any given election that a Democrat could get elected to statewide office in South Dakota than it is in any of those three aforementioned states. But that's just not going to happen this time, at least. Mike Rounds will be fine, as will Ben Sasse in Nebraska. Now, I have said before on this channel that I think this Kansas race is a little overblown. I think it's getting a little too much buzz. I've said before, and I still kind of stand by this, that I think if what happened in 2018 hadn't happened, nobody would be talking about this race. Even if the polling, let's say, was even a little bit more favorable to Barbara Bollier, I still don't think anyone would be talking about this if not for 2018. I mean, let's look at the most recent polls here. You know, by and large, Roger Marshall, the GOP candidate, has been leading throughout. Okay, let's look at the most recent polls. +4, a tie, +12, -3, +7, -2, +4, tie. +2, +1, +10, -1, +1, and -1. That's going all the way back to June. So clearly, what yeah, it's not a safe state for the Republicans. And I think that Barbara Bollier is a very good candidate for this race. She's a state senator. She's a former Republican. She's done everything she can. She's raised a great amount of money. Roger Marshall, by the way, has done a very poor job of being able to match any kind of consistent donation. I mean, he has not performed well at all on the money front. I do think we're going to have to count the vote. This is not going to be called right at closing hour, just as most of these will. But, at the end of the day, do we really expect Barbara Bollier to win this seat? No, I really don't think we do. I think this is a doomsday scenario for the Republicans. Like, if it comes to something like this, where at the same time, look, we know about turnout in this election. We know Democratic enthusiasm is pretty much at an all-time high. Okay, we thought it was pretty high in 2018 when they flipped 40 House seats and 7 governorships. But they also did lose a net of 2 Senate seats, and they've had some special election victories. We know what happened in Alabama. There have been some state legislature special elections that have been very good. We saw what happened, very good for the Democrats. We saw what happened in Wisconsin with the Supreme Court race. Is this going to be one of them? It's possible. I would give Barbara Bollier about a 10% chance of winning the seat. So more of a likelihood characterization of labeling it likely. Jim Inhofe is safe. Now, in Texas, we saw a slight narrowing of John Cornyn's lead against MJ Hager, who, again, is very similar to Amy McGrath. Both of them ran unsuccessfully for the House in Republican states 2 years ago and have now shifted gears and are running against Republican senators Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn. This is not 2018. Okay, Beto O'Rourke came pretty darn close to defeating Ted Cruz. Unless Ted Cruz loses sometime down the line, that'll definitely be the hardest race he has ever faced. Okay, and MJ Hager has not raised nearly the amount of money that Beto O'Rourke has. I think part of that is just the party is focused elsewhere. They know that there are more vulnerable GOP senators. Now, on the presidential level, this is definitely, I mean, this is a swing state on the presidential level. It's basically like, I'd say it's equivalent to North Carolina, basically, on the presidential level. But on the Senate level, I don't think it's quite the same. Now, I expect John Cornyn to win, but don't discount the fact that MJ Hager is going to get about 46% of the vote here. And that just speaks to how much the state of Texas has changed. And going forward, the Republican Party is going to have to spend an awful lot of money here to keep it in their column. Now, the only statewide race here in 22 is the governor, that being Greg Abbott, who's obviously not too favorable right now, even amongst his own Republican constituents. We've learned that recently, and they have a very controversial attorney general down there. But Texas is continuing to shift bluer and bluer. I'm fascinated to see what the final results will be. I just recently, in our 8-day presidential election prediction video, characterized Texas as tilt red again after switching it back from tilt blue. I'm just fascinated to see what the final results are. Even though I don't think MJ Hager is going to win, and she's definitely the weaker candidate between her and Biden, I still think she's going to reach 45, 46, maybe 47%. So I'm going to label it lean Republican. Now, in Minnesota, kind of an interesting development here. We know that Tina Smith was already favored, but kind of a troubling development happened here when it was either yesterday or the day, Jason Lewis, the Republican candidate for this race, underwent emergency surgery for what was deemed to be a massive internal hernia, and yeah, it was like a life-threatening situation for Jason, and apparently, I mean, I don't want to politicize that too much. That's obviously a very scary situation for him. The thing is, I mean, regardless of what I actually think about how that might end up, there's only 8 days left, and we knew that Tina Smith was firmly in the driver's seat in the state anyway. She won in what was a tougher year for her to win 2 years ago, in that she was replacing a resigned Senator, Al Franken, who resigned maybe not in disgrace, but on, not exactly reputable terms. So I'm going to label this safe. Obviously, our thoughts are with Jason Lewis and his family right now, and we'll see if he is able to, sufficiently recover Can he get, just for like appear in a last minute ad or something like that? Because we're obviously hoping that his condition improves. Now in Iowa, this is literally a coin flip. But with every passing hour, my mind kind of changes about this race, because there's so much to it. In the House, the Democrats have the edge. There are only 4 districts in Iowa. The Democrats control 3 of them. And the 4th one is competitive. J.D. Scholten, who ran against Steve King a few years ago, lost. He is losing again to the person that Steve King was primaried by. But it's close. It's worth mentioning. And then also the gubernatorial race here in 2018 was a significant narrowing up from the presidential race in 16. Now, when I say significant, it was about 6 points and change better for the Democrats and Fred Hubbell, the Democrat gubernatorial candidate in that race, compared to Hillary Clinton in 16. Meanwhile, in the Senate, the Republicans have both senators here, as we know, Joni Ernst and Charles Grassley, who may be retiring and leaving an open seat in 2022. Joni Ernst is on life support. This is literally the closest race she's ever faced. We know about her famous Let's Make Them Squeal ad back in 2014. She had a very, very, very embarrassing moment in the last Senate debate between these two. Teresa Greenfield was asked about the trading price of a bushel of corn, and Greenfield was able to answer correctly. And then when Ernst was asked a similar question, she was not able to answer it correctly, was given a second chance, and then just balked at it altogether. So now, look, I don't know how Iowa voters are going to take that. I don't know if it means a lot to them or a little to them. But at the same time, again, a lot of people have already voted. We know that. We expect turnout to be high here. This is always sort of primary central, Iowa and New Hampshire. And so I think right now, the most recent polling has Teresa Greenfield just barely ahead. And I will say this also for Teresa Greenfield's sake. She has led in the more highly ranked pollsters than Joni Ernst has. Okay, Joni Ernst has led in her fair share, but they're in like Trafalgar Group or SurveyMonkey, some of those lesser regarded pollsters. So I still have this as a third pickup for the Democrats and Tilt Blue. Tom Cotton will easily defeat the independent Dan Whitfield, and Bill Cassidy will cruise to re-election in Louisiana. Those will both be called right at closing hour. Remember, Arkansas is the one state that closes, I believe, on a half hour. I think it's like 9:30 Eastern when it closes. It's the only state. It's always been a weird custom, but whatever. It's just how they do it. Now, Mike Espy, I give him credit for trying again. He's sticking with it. He's trying again against Cindy Hyde-Smith. Cindy Hyde-Smith defeated him by 8 percentage points in that special election, 54 to 46. Of course, then Cindy Hyde-Smith was far more vulnerable, because she had recently made some pretty damaging, I guess, comments racially, and she still was able to defeat him. That's an accident, by the way. I didn't mean to do that. And so Mike Espy, he just hasn't been able to generate the same enthusiasm. He hasn't in his own state, but he just hasn't generated nearly the same enthusiasm and fundraising as some of his other Democratic Senate candidates. The Lincoln Project did recently throw their hat into the ring here, and we know what kind of power they hold. They have raised so much money that they have jumped into races that I think a lot of us would consider just complete. I was very surprised when they jumped into this race because, Mississippi, we can all expect that Cindy Hyde-Smith is going to pull this one out. Now, in Alabama, we know Doug Jones is obviously a very both sides. He's a very admirable figure. He's had a career that, no one can argue with, and it was obviously quite a feat for him to defeat Roy Moore in that special election. But this isn't Roy Moore. Okay, now while Tommy Tuberville may not be the world's most robust candidate either, seeing as he comes from the sidelines of an NFL football field and not from elected office, the reality of the situation is this is Alabama. And, Doug Jones is a Democrat. Those things don't really go together. So right now I also have this as a likely state for Tommy Tuberville and the Republicans. Now in Georgia, we have 2 Senate races here that are very interesting to break down. The first of which is the general election race between Jon Ossoff and David Perdue. Now, David Perdue has led most of the campaign season, and Jon Ossoff has been able to pull ahead several times, not on the averages, just in individual polls, but every time he does that, he's only able to get ahead by like 1%, maybe 2%. I believe there was a poll a few days ago that had him actually up by 3%. But the ones David Perdue has won are usually by a little bit wider margins. Now, look, David Perdue knew he was in a competitive race. He really didn't help himself when he did that whole thing, intentionally mispronouncing Kamala Harris's name. Really stupid of him to do that. Okay, it's not that hard to get elected as a Republican in Georgia. It's harder than it used to be, but but it's just not that hard. Jon Ossoff is definitely the one fighting the uphill battle here, and it just got a little less steep for him because of that. And within hours, I think within 24 hours, Jon Ossoff's campaign raised over $2 million. Okay, now per his campaign, and we'll just have to take their word for this, since the 2018 midterms in which Stacey Abrams came close against Brian Kemp, the state of Georgia has 750,000 new registered voters. That's really high, okay? And we've seen some crazy early voting turnout numbers in this state. Similarly to Texas, we're seeing just shattered records left and right. Okay, and so it's really interesting. I think that I would say like 6-8 weeks ago, this was like a very competitive race, and I think Ossoff would I would have predicted Ossoff would peter out around 47%. There was a poll just today from the University of Georgia. Okay, that's a reliable pollster that also sampled a pretty large size, 1,145 likely voters, which is a large, for most polls, and it was conducted over 10 days. Actually had Ossoff leading by 1%. Okay, so that is pretty interesting. And the one that was released just the day before from YouGov, another very reliable pollster, had David Perdue only up by 1 point. Okay, so the higher the population is in these sample sizes that we've seen over the course of and this is held true, it's not just throughout the campaign season, it's not just these last two polls, the higher the sample size, the better Jon Ossoff performs. Okay, I'm only able to label this tilt for David Perdue, but it's close. Okay, this is a tight race. As I said, like maybe 2 months ago, I would have said Ossoff would get around 47%. But now I think he's in that 48.5%, 49% range. Meaning, and this is important here, David Perdue needs to win with a majority here. Okay, if he only gets a plurality of the vote, or I guess I should say, I don't think he should bank on winning with only a plurality. Okay, because Jon Ossoff's going to be, if it's a plurality and he's less than 50%, Jon Ossoff's going to be within less than a point at that point. And, we don't know what's going to happen considering this is ridiculously high turnout in this election, and it's a state where there are a lot of minority voters, and we know how they feel going into this election. The data shows that. So just keep an eye on this. Like, David Perdue needs to clear 50%. If he doesn't, he's in deep trouble. All right, now in the special election here, this was also a state that like 2 months ago, no one was even talking about. And in our predictions, we labeled it safe just right out of the gate. We hardly even mentioned it. That is not the case now, okay? Raphael Warnock was in part of this primary that's going on here. It's a jungle system, so there are, 18 different candidates. 2 of them are Republican. There are really 3 left. 2 of them are Republicans, Doug Collins and Kelly Loeffler, and then Warnock for the Democrats. Now, there are still some other Democrats in the field, but they're not really, part of this race. So here's the thing. Warnock suddenly leapt into first place. Okay, just jumped all the way into first place, which is not that big a deal in a primary. We know the drill. You just add up the second and third place finishers if they're the same party, which most of the time they are, and then you just consolidate that, and usually that usurps the first place vote getter. Now, in most polls, that has happened. However, the third or the fourth and fifth place finishers are also Democrats. And that usually adds like another 8-9% to Warnock's total. Now, are both candidates that advance to the runoff in January going to get every single one of those votes, from the opposite candidate? Not necessarily, but they're going to get a lot of them. Okay, they're going to get a lot of them. And Raphael Warnock has led in some of these polls by like 13 and 15 like big numbers. A lot of that, I think, had to do with the fact that Barack Obama endorsed him. And so that helped consolidate some of the support surrounding Matt Lieberman. Now, Matt Lieberman has got to be just beside himself because his own father endorsed Susan Collins up in Maine. I don't know about you. If I was running for Senate and my own father endorsed a candidate of the opposite party, it wouldn't be a pretty Thanksgiving. But whatever, that's what happened. And so I think voters have just begun to ignore Matt Lieberman and some of the others that are behind even him, and are really rallying around Warnock. And so I expect it to be Doug Collins and Warnock. The issue the Democrats are going to have is, say this race goes into January, and assuming no one gets 50%, and that's very likely that no one will, the Democratic Party cannot rely on the same turnout that year, or in January. Even if the control of the Senate rests on that seat, they still can't rely on that. I think people are exhausted with politics. People are exhausted by this campaign. And can you imagine what it's like in Georgia? Because that's a swing state on the presidential level, and there are 2 competitive Senate races. So can you just imagine being a sort of a voter who doesn't give too much of a rip about politics, and all you've heard for months is about the Jon Ossoff, David Perdue race, and then this special election race and the presidential race, and then months later you're hearing all of a sudden, oh my God, now I've got to wait again for I got to hear all about this special election race now. Come on. So that's an issue, and because of that, and also the fact I would imagine even with high turnout, I would still expect Doug Collins to just barely beat out Raphael Warnock. I would label that tilt Republican. If Kelly Loeffler advances, I might even label it lean Democrat. Okay, now in South Carolina, the Republicans got a big shot in the arm here just today. A poll which I did not recognize, but apparently has some considerably new and kind of, state-of-the-art, I guess, cutting-edge methodology called Starboard Communications, had Lindsey Graham leading by 9%. Over Jamie Harrison. Now it's only 800 voters, but that's kind of a nail in the coffin in a sense for Jamie Harrison. Now again, it's just one poll, and we saw over the last couple of weeks that Lindsey Graham was the one who was losing, essentially, basically saying like if this race lasted another 3-4 weeks, Harrison may have pulled ahead just because of the momentum we're seeing. But here's the thing, like even if it's sort of an outlier poll, this is South Carolina, and Lindsey Graham still leads on the averages. So if you get a poll like that, like Lindsey Graham has sort of earned the benefit of the doubt a little bit. And so that's why I'm going to label this now lean Republican. At this point, as great a campaign as Jamie Harrison has run, and the amount of money that they have raised and spent, as ridiculous an amount as that is, I just think at the end of the day, I'd give him now about a 20% chance of winning this race. Definitely bigger than Barbara Bollier, twice as big as I labeled it for Barbara Bollier in Kansas. But I definitely would be surprised at this point if Jamie Harrison was able to pull this out. Again, there are 8 days left, and so we might get a little bit of some more polling in that state. But that poll right there, Starboard Communications, it doesn't cement it for me. And even if Lindsey Graham wins 3 polls in a row between now and election night by 20 points, it's close enough to where we definitely need to watch. But I would, at this point, I would definitely be surprised. Bill Hagerty is going to be fine in Tennessee. Now, in North Carolina, Cal Cunningham's sexting scandal does appear to have hurt him a little bit. His lead has shrunk. Okay, it has. The thing is, though, he was just ahead by a big enough margin before this whole thing broke that it's not going to end up killing him. It's not going to be a death sentence for him. And that's important because, the Democrats need this seat. Okay, and let me just kind of stop here for a second and take you through a little bit of what I kind of see unfolding on election night. We go east to west on election night just because of the time differences. So that means on the presidential level, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania will all be called within the first little while. Okay. Joe Biden's campaign is going to have a pretty nice idea of whether or not they're going to be able to flip enough votes in order to win this race. Donald Trump's campaign is going to have a pretty good idea of whether or not they're going to have another 4 years within the first couple hours. Because as we start to move west, you know, Arizona, once you get past, kind of the midpoint here, Arizona is the only state left that's really considered a swing state anymore. Once we get past Texas, it's just kind of Arizona, and there aren't very many scenarios that end up with it just being Arizona. Now, obviously, we have to go through a lot of Senate races because we got to get through Iowa, we got to get through Texas, Montana, Colorado, right? And then it's a long, long wait until we even begin in Alaska. But the reason I say this is kind of the tipping point here for me, because if the Democrats win this Senate seat here, if Cal Cunningham wins this Senate seat, that to me is the seat they need in order to flip the majority. We kind of know that there's shoo-ins out here, Arizona and Colorado, and again, they're really at 47 seats, but let's be honest, it's 46. Doug Jones is going to lose. That's a rental in Alabama. So they know that they have these two, not in the bag, but very close to it in Colorado and Arizona to get them to 48 and get them within striking distance. So, that would afford them the ability to potentially still come up a little short in Montana. But this is the one they have to get, because if they don't get this one, then they're basically looking at Maine as an absolute must win to get themselves to 49. And I don't think it's a good position for them to be in, to be having to rely on Iowa, Iowa, Montana, and then one of these in Georgia, and then a long shot in South Carolina to get that to flip the Senate altogether, or even just reach 50 with a tiebreaker with the vice presidency. But if they win this seat, that changes, and they definitely have then the opportunity to get to an outright majority at 51 should they lose the presidency. And it means it also, to me, signals a little bit of a bellwether effect, that if North Carolina goes the Democratic Party's way, which the polling indicates it might just, that to me signifies how the rest of the night might unfold. So this is the seat that I think the Democrats absolutely must get in order for them to really realize some of these like Democratic sweep dreams. So back to this race individually, Thom Tillis is extremely vulnerable right now. His positive COVID diagnosis couldn't have come at a worse time, because that was right basically when Cunningham's sexting scandal emerged. So he wasn't really able to go on offense as a result, right? Immediately thereafter. So that has not helped him. And then furthermore, I just, at the end of the day, Roy Cooper being well ahead of Dan Forest in this gubernatorial race, I think is going to boost both Cunningham and Joe Biden. Turnout levels have been high here, as they have almost everywhere in the early voting totals. So I expect Cal Cunningham to win this race with a tilt, which is a crucial win for the Democrats. We know Dick Durbin is going to be fine in Illinois, McConnell will be fine in Kentucky, and Shelley Moore Capito will easily win in West Virginia, just as Mark Warner will in Virginia. So the Democrats are at 44, the Republicans are at 49. Now, Michigan is really the last, Michigan's the only other pickup opportunity for the Republicans other than Alabama. John James is a very good candidate. He's a strong case. He's kind of an upstart figure in Michigan politics for the GOP. He gave it a try against Debbie Stabenow 2 years ago and came up short. And now he's trying again. Okay, he came up short. He got like 45.7, I think, percent of the vote up there. Respectable, but short. And he's trying it again here. I think it'll ultimately be kind of the same thing. Now, I know that some people have said Gary Peters should be a little bit worried. I get why they say that. To me, though, that's a little bit more out of just trying to guard against complacency than it is about actual fear that Gary Peters is really going to end up losing this race. I'd be very surprised if John James won here, because Michigan is just that state that I think we all agree at this point is probably the most likely of the states that went for Trump in 2016 to flip back. Okay, it was very kind to the Democrats in the midterms. Of these Rust Belt states, it kind of has the most left-leaning tinge to it. It was the closest of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin for Donald Trump in 2016. He only won it by 0.27%. And again, that was in spite of a Democratic candidate that didn't even visit it in the closing stages of the campaign. I'd be very surprised at this point if Gary Peters ended up losing. And it's not like John James has ever actually led here anyway. Okay, and for a long time, Peters was up by double digits. It's just that it's narrowed since then. So this is a little bit of a bold claim, but I'm going to go from a likelihood characterization that this is going to be likely. Again, just to refresh you a little bit, these characters, it's likelihood versus margin, okay? Like Iowa here, that's kind of both because it's such on a knife, it's really on a knife's edge, and that's literally what the margin is going to be. Think of it this way: like tilt is anywhere between like less than 1% to 2%, and then lean can be 2 to 5%, likely 5 to 10%, and then safe I would say is like maybe not quite 10. I would say 10 is 10 or above is safe. John, but on the other hand, like you can have two schools. Both things can be true at the same time, right? Where this can end up being a lean margin, but I can also fully expect Gary Peters to win, and that's kind of why I have it as a likely. Now we know that I think we also agree that the VP nod is at this point going to go to the Democratic Party's way. Okay, look, the Biden-Harris ticket is winning comfortably, at least at the moment. There are only 8 days left. It's not enough time, really, for the Trump campaign to make this up. We kept saying the race is going to narrow, it's going to narrow, it's going to narrow. It really hasn't. And then here are 4 more safe Democratic seats: Chris Coons in Delaware, Cory Booker in New Jersey, Jack Reed in Rhode Island, and Ed Markey in Massachusetts. Ed Markey, of course, survived a tough primary, but he won, and he's easily going to win, probably by 25 to 30 points. Now, New Hampshire, there is at least like a sort of a semblance of a real race here. Jeanne Shaheen, the Democrat, is in position, though, firmly in the driver's seat to win this race. In New Hampshire, though, I mean, look, the Republican Party can do well in this state. They have to nominate a notable candidate who's a little bit of a moderate. If they do that, they can have success here. That's not who Kelly Ayotte is. Okay, now policy-wise, she's kind of just down the middle, or down the middle for a Republican, I should say. Whereas she's just not notable. Okay, I had no idea who Kelly Ayotte was before this. I mean, whereas Chris Sununu is not that. He's a very notable guy, and if he runs in 2 years against Maggie Hassan, who won her race by only about 1,000 votes in 2016, he might win. But Jeanne Shaheen's going to be fine. That gets the Democrats their 50th seat. Now in Maine, as I said last night, and I say it again tonight, I think time has run out on Susan Collins. I do. I defended her throughout the campaign season on this channel. I repeatedly said that, look, she's a resilient figure. She is someone that, it takes a lot to defeat her. You have to basically run a perfect campaign. You have to have like examples of her not being a bipartisan senator, all that stuff. It has to be a Democratic wave year, everything. That has happened, unfortunately, for her. Now, she got a little bit of a last-minute boost when Joe Lieberman, a Democrat, endorsed her. But I don't know how much love Democratic voters really have for Joe Lieberman in the first place. Okay, so given his history. So I don't know that there are many Democrats that really care about that. And look, the other fact of the matter is I also said over and over again that I at some point, Susan Collins will overtake Sarah Gideon in the polls, and she'll begin to reverse that. That just never happened. It never happened. And even though I repeatedly characterized the state for Sarah Gideon, at the end of the day, I kept pointing out eventually Susan Collins might be able to turn this around. There are 8 days left. She hasn't done that. She's been outraised. Sarah Gideon is in the driver's seat. She is the favorite. I'm going to label this lean. And there is the majority for the Democrats. 5 flips, Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, North Carolina, and Maine, and a net gain of 4 seats given a loss in Alabama. So let's go through all the winners as we always do. Dan Sullivan wins in Alaska, Jeff Merkley in Oregon, Jim Risch in Idaho. Steve Daines defeats Steve Bullock narrowly in Montana. Mike Enzi wins another 6 years in Wyoming. John Hickenlooper, after running for president briefly, wins his Senate race, ousting Cory Gardner. Mark Kelly defeats Martha McSally in Arizona for a second Democratic pickup on the night, and Ben Ray Lujan holds this open seat for the Democrats. Mike Rounds wins in South Dakota. Ben Sasse in Nebraska. Roger Marshall wins an interesting race against Barbara Boyer. Jim Inhofe easily wins in Oklahoma, and John Cornyn survives against MJ Hager. Tina Smith defeats Jason Lewis up here in Minnesota. She gets her first full 6-year term. The coin flip ends up in Teresa Greenfield's favor here in Iowa. For a third Democratic pickup, Dan Whitfield, the independent, doesn't come close against Tom Cotton, and Bill Cassidy easily wins in Louisiana. Cindy Hyde-Smith again defeats Mike Espy. Tommy Tuberville unseats Democratic incumbent Doug Jones for a Republican flip. In Georgia, John Ossoff comes very close, but still no cigar against David Perdue. And then likely, I still have this as Doug Collins moving on to narrowly defeat Raphael Warnock in the special election Senate race. Lindsey Graham ultimately puts away Jamie Harrison. Bill Hagerty wins easily in Tennessee. Cal Cunningham overcomes his own scandals in North Carolina. Dick Durbin easily wins in Illinois. McConnell defeats Amy McGrath in Kentucky. Only in this instance, he now becomes a minority leader. Shelley Moore Capito easily wins in West Virginia, and Mark Warner wins in Virginia. Now in Michigan, John James runs a good, tough race, but ultimately falls short of Gary Peters. And then Kamala Harris is elected vice president, and Chris Coons, Cory Booker, Jack Reed, and Ed Markey all are elected to another 6-year term. In New Hampshire, Jeanne Shaheen fends off a challenge from Kelly Ayotte, and then in a big high-profile win for the Democrats, Sarah Gideon defeats Susan Collins, giving the Democrats 5 flips on the night. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please comment down in the suggestions below. Hit the subscribe button if you have not already. Again, I'll do my best to answer any comments, concerns, questions, or corrections, whatever you may have for me down in the comment sections below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. So thank you guys again so much for watching. I'll see you in November.